Without further ado, I would love to introduce our next speaker, Ryan K. is what I call him. His mentor is Jared Stewart. Thank you, Jared Stewart. Do you want to get your title back up for me so I can remember it? Something about the aerospace industry and lobbying. Yes, Ryan K.
Okay. All right, so as Dr. Cook was just saying, I'm Ryan Klein, and just in case you're confused, there's also a Ryan S. over there who presented on Runner's High. However, unlike him, I am presenting on things related to stuff that flies high, which in this case deals with the aerospace industry. And I'm analyzing how regulations in the aerospace industry are affected by political lobbying. So, to give you a quick overview of what my project is about, I'm covering political lobbying and how effective it might be in affecting regulations and getting interest groups things that favor them much more. And the main example I'm going to be covering is the aerospace industry. And it is surprisingly relevant, which is entirely a coincidence. Now, what exactly is political lobbying? To give a brief definition for it, think of it as individuals or groups with certain interests going to the government and lobbying or advocating for things that favor them much more, or things that might benefit them. An example might be, say, more favorable laws or regulations, or maybe funding for them that could help them benefit in whatever it is they're doing. And for whatever flaws it may have, it is ultimately a core element of American politics as we know it, because besides the representatives and senators we have in Congress to represent all of us as a whole, being able to lobby the government in one way or another, it's also a way for us to represent ourselves directly, to really show that our interests are important and to really give some attention to it. To really emphasize the significance, let's take a look at the financials of it. So millions each year are spent by many, many companies. So for example, on Open Secrets, which is a nonprofit organization that uses open source data to get information about how much companies spend each year in government lobbying, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, each of them has spent at least $10 million in just the last year alone lobbying the government in one way or another for legislation or funding or whatever else it may be. And this sort of money being spent, it translates to a whole lot of influence in government and whatnot, and also access to different ways of getting whatever it is they want. And that ultimately means power. And for that sort of influence, really, oftentimes it's not exactly accessible to a lot of the everyday people, because unless you happen to have a couple $1 million lying around, I don't really, it's not something that's really open to a lot of people, really. And to emphasize this even more, we could maybe mention something that's been on the news that maybe a lot of you know as well, and that is the controversy going on with Boeing. It's gone on for years at this point, but most recently there's been an incident where a door quite literally blew out mid-flight. And that's something that's been on the news for a long time, and it's gotten Boeing into a whole lot of controversy with not just the public, but also the government as a whole. And to really give you an example of that sort of controversy happening in the past, in 2022, the FAA was limiting the ability for Boeing to self-regulate themselves by sort of limiting how much time they can really regulate themselves instead of having the FAA directly do it instead. And of course, there's also whistleblowers coming out talking about all the controversies going on with the manufacturing of planes as well, and how there's flaws that are sort of being overlooked and all that. And this is stuff that's very significant to the aerospace industry. And while we could go on about why it's happening, sometimes it's also a good idea to maybe explore how exactly this came to be in the first place. And one of the ways we can do that is by looking into political lobbying. So, I'm going to briefly cover lobbying methods, for example, because I sort of want to focus more on the kind of people that really impact the effectiveness of these lobbying methods. So, for example, there's advocacy. It can involve everyday people like you or me, or groups of everyday people going to their government officials and sort of advocating for whatever it is they find to be most important to them at heart. So, for example, maybe we could be advocating, saying, hey, there needs to be something done about this of stopping planes from falling apart out of the sky. Or maybe it could be that one really odd person who's advocating for planes to sort of like fall apart out of the sky because they want to have parts for their bizarre collection of souvenirs or whatnot. As for most of us, I think we can all agree that it's maybe a bad idea for that. And we all want our planes to be in one piece and for plane parts to not fall on us. So, going back from that, another thing could be contributions. And that's where the financial information comes back in, really. Because with the millions of dollars that Lockheed Martin and Boeing spend, they can put that towards a whole bunch of different ways of spending that. So, for example, one of the ways they could do that is through contributions. And through contributions, they could, say, fund campaigns of certain political officials. Maybe certain politicians might be looking to get reelected once again, and they might need money to do that. And through contributions, maybe they could be swayed into agreeing to certain issues or to pass certain legislation and all that. And lastly, there's simply giving information about topics. So, for example, could be presentations like this that you're sort of sitting through right now. Or maybe it could be giving out pamphlets or whole packets like this containing research and information and whatnot that politicians and their interns could use to make certain important decisions and whatnot. So, moving on to the sort of people that might be impacting political lobbying are revolving door politicians. And put simply, these are politicians that after serving some time in office, they leave their jobs and go to work as lobbyists for certain interest groups. And what they do there is they take the connections, the friendships and relationships they've gotten over the years in time in office, along with the influence they might have. And they use that to get more favorable things to be lobbying for. So, for example, maybe they might use their connections to get favorable funding for something, or maybe they might use it to get certain politicians to vote for something and all that. And that's something significant to keep a note of, though their effectiveness as lobbyists could really depend on their value. So, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, let's go with an example of what makes a good revolving door politician and what makes a less valuable revolving door politician. So, for example, the best connections are the ones that are most related to the interest group's sort of values, really. And for aerospace, for example, they might be more interested in connections with appropriations to get funding for certain aircraft to be bought, or maybe armed services if they're going through the military route to get funding to buy, say, fighter jets or cargo planes and all that. And of course, because aerospace involves a lot of science, they could be looking into having connections with those who might be on Space Science Technology Committee. And so, for example, it might be a good idea for this hypothetical revolving door politician to maybe have good connections with, say, the chair of Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers, who's a representative from Alabama, or maybe someone who's the chair of appropriations, like Kay Granger, who's the representative for this district we're in. Having a politician with these sorts of connections to politicians like them that can make them very valuable and more effective in getting more favorable results. However, what might make a revolving door politician less favorable could be, say, having less relevant connections. So, for example, with the better connections I mentioned earlier of maybe having a revolving door politician who has good connections or influences to those who might be on the committee for appropriations or armed services or science and technology. If they have connections with other representatives on other committees, such as, say, agriculture or health, education, labor, and pensions, that's not as related or as relevant to the interests of the aerospace industry. So, for example, even though they might have good connections with, say, Senator Mike Braun from Indiana, even though it's valuable to have good connections with a senator from Indiana, it's not as related to the aerospace industry's interests as a whole. And of course, there's also other things. So going back to our other connections, maybe, for example, they might have fewer connections, or maybe their politicians that they have good connections with are leaving office. So, for example, going back to Kay Granger, she's currently retiring as far as I'm aware, and that might mean that the revolving door politician's connections with a representative like her might not be as valuable because she's retiring and she might not have as much influence or as many good connections that might be valuable to the aerospace industry's interests. And that can also mean having fewer connections, and they're not going to be as valuable or as effective. This is a bit of a simplification, really, because connections can be to a lot more than just representatives and senators. It can also be to members who are in charge of certain departments of the government, or maybe to certain other positions in state-level governments and all that. But that's just an example to help us sort of understand what makes a good revolving door politician. However, there is a bit of a counter to this, and it's that even though revolving door politicians can be very valuable and very effective in what they do, it can also not mean as much if there are other everyday people who sort of lobby and advocate for their interests. There's been some research that's been shown that regular people or groups made up of regular everyday people, they might have much more of a influence on politicians because, after all, these are people that are the constituents of a politician's district and whatnot, and they might be much more inclined to listen to them and all that. And that's something to really keep in mind because it has a lot of potential to really impact how effective these sorts of politicians are in maybe lobbying and whatnot. However, there are some flaws that should definitely be mentioned. So, for example, politics can vary from place to place. Going back to that whole research I mentioned earlier, whenever I was going over that, it mentioned that it was sort of looking over how that relationship between the effectiveness of interest groups made up of corporations and interest groups made up of regular people have on government decisions. And that took place in Canada rather than the US. And even though the US and Canada may be slightly similar, there's a lot of differences, not just culturally, but also governmentally. So to maybe go a little smaller in our example, maybe we could compare, say, Texas and California. Texas has a lot more oil and gas companies that have much more influence on the state government level, and California might be more towards being more green, more environmentally friendly, because oil and gas companies might not have as much of an influence there. And so that might mean that even though lobbying methods or lobbying effectiveness with environment might be a lot more effective in California, it might not be as effective in, say, Texas. And there's also some other things, such as the real gray area that involves political lobbying and corruption. So, for example, there might be some cases where corruption and political lobbying might overlap in that sometimes there's deals that take place behind closed doors. With corruption on one hand, it's almost always taking place behind closed doors because it's illegal and in some ways maybe immoral, because it's not just violating the law, obviously, it's also involving underhanded tactics that really go against the sort of good faith strategies that a lot of other interest groups also do, because they're assuming that everyone else acts in good faith and all that. While with lobbying, however, it only takes place behind closed doors some of the time, really. And that's because for some cases, maybe they might be dealing with contracts they're competing for that might deal with something classified or something secret. And it's not always a good idea to have that sort of dealings out in the open. Sometimes it's important for that sort of deals to take place in secret. And of course, the effectiveness of all these methods isn't exactly fully known because, as we've sort of established with revolving door politicians and everyday people, even though they can be more effective in some cases, and other times, whenever they sort of come together, it can be really hard to determine who's more effective in whatever scenario it might be. And in some ways, it's hard to really measure that because there isn't exactly a real lot of research into that. However, there are some possible methods that could be used to measure the results that come out of that. Now, one example is spatial econometrics. I'm going to be honest, this is a whole lot of math and it's a whole lot of statistics. My specialty is more in calculus rather than statistics. So to really keep it simple, let's say that you're analyzing something that involves, say, two axes. Now, that's how it might work in studying stuff regularly. However, I can bring this over here. All right, let's bring this over here. That's some artistic touch to this. However, with spatial econometrics, this can really cover stuff that's a lot more complex than having just two axes, because oftentimes there can be scenarios that involve way more variables. So for example, maybe it could involve, say, location and proximity of different places to one another. And spatial econometrics can cover that by including those variables too, and using, say, economic data and equations and whatnot. And of course, statistics, you can use spatial econometrics to really get more detailed information and data on that. And of course, it's not just, say, location and proximity. It can also be a whole bunch of other variables too. So, for example, let's go back to Boeing. Boeing, for example, at some point in the past, they moved their headquarters from Washington State to Chicago. And while you could look at the effectiveness of their lobbying on the surface, you could say use spatial econometrics to really look more in depth into that by including other variables such as location, proximity, but also other things, say being closer to their suppliers for their parts, or to other businesses they might work with, or maybe other businesses they're also competing against. And that's something to really keep in mind for spatial econometrics, and that's one way of using it and one possible method of analyzing how effective political lobbying can be in certain situations. So, moving on to other things, there's also another way of doing it, and that's analyzing competition and their actions, really, because it's a lot more than, say, connections or influence. A lot of the time, having more effective lobbying can simply involve just having better results for whatever it is you're doing, because results are everything. So for one example, really, I can go over an aerospace-related example, that being the Joint Strike Fighter program. So back in the 90s, there was a project made by the Department of Defense where they wanted a next-generation fighter, and there were two main competitors, Boeing and Lockheed Martin. In the end, it was Lockheed Martin that really won out, and the reason why is because they had better results, not just in performance, but also in stuff like being slightly cheaper than Boeing's projected costs, and not just in terms of fighters, but overall, really. Though one could also say that maybe they didn't exactly like the look of that. Look at that smile. And that's really one example of how results might impact the effectiveness of lobbying, because whenever you have good results on your side, it makes it much more easier for a company or an interest group to lobby for having their product be the more favored choice instead of, say, their competitors. Now, throughout this time, I've just been using the aerospace industry as an example because it's sort of relevant to real life and it's also relevant to my major. However, some examples of political lobbying and analyzing its effectiveness can be used for other things, such as advertising regulations. So, for example, maybe gambling companies might be looking to influence regulations so they can advertise much more in other states, or maybe alcohol companies or vapes and tobaccos, they might want to influence regulations on advertising because they might want to focus more on a younger audience for whatever reasons they might want. There's also environmental regulations. So oil and gas companies are a big one. They might want more relaxed environmental regulations because the stuff they deal with, it involves a lot of pollution and whatnot. And maybe they might want more favorable environmental regulations to cut corners or save costs in a way. And of course, there's also health and medical regulations. And one big example I can point out is maybe how some companies have insulin priced at very expensive rates because they want to maximize their profits on it. But there's also some people who may want to set price ceilings to prevent insulin from being very overpriced or expensive. And insurance and health companies and whatnot, they might be lobbying against that because they want to max out the profits, and having a price ceiling can really affect that.
You better stop there, Ryan, and that way you can see if you have a quick question or two.
Okay, so that's just some of the many examples. Of course, there's also other things as well, like more research to be done, such as with addressing ethical concerns, or maybe finding more effective lobbying results or trying to apply it to other situations. There's also stuff about regulation solutions to current issues, such as with revolving door politicians. Maybe there could be term limits instituted to limit their effectiveness to maybe impact that in a way. And of course, there's also counterpoints to address that maybe I didn't get time to look over, or maybe I didn't get time to really find more information on. And of course, there's finances for campaigns and whatnot that should be addressed too. So before I get to questions, a quick acknowledgement. Thank you to Professor Stewart for being my mentor. Thank you to the library for their help, specifically Ms. Rankin over there. And thank you to Dr. Cook and the honors program for this research opportunity. And while we quickly go over questions, I decided to be a little fun, a little different, and put a QR code over there for sources. So if you want to scan that and look over it, you can. In the meantime, any questions? Mr. Lin?
So you briefly mentioned about like lobbying versus corruption. Is there any like standard that, oh, this is lobbying, and if you go beyond this point, this is corruption? Or is it simply like the deal is behind the door? It's all.
I was meant to mention something that would have differentiated that, but in the research paper I mentioned, one of the main differences they found between corruption and lobbying is that for corruption, it's meant to benefit only a select few that are in on it, while with lobbying, it's meant to benefit much more people as a whole, really. Dr. Trickett?
Thank you, Ryan. Very, very well done. Good job. Did you find any research about a distinction between lobbyists, like paid lobbyists, versus principled lobbying? So I'm thinking of, Boeing is going to pay somebody to go and be a lobbyist. That is their job. Versus somebody who might feel very passionately because they have skin in the game, so they want to make sure that things change, right? Was there any research you found that talked about the effectiveness of one over the other, or the moral reliability of one over the other?
That definitely seems like an ethical concern. I was definitely looking over some research, but I wasn't able to find any on that. I do think that if I plan to maybe carry on with this research when I transfer to Tarleton, I think that's definitely one of the main points I could definitely look into.
Very good, thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Any more?
Thank you so much.